Prelude, how it all began. If anyone ever asks whose brilliant idea it was to hold the Olympic Games in this dusty little village, let me be perfectly clear. It wasn't mine. I would deny it until the end of time. And yet here I am, the so-called chief organizer, which in practice means I am the unfortunate soul responsible for making sure the temple doesn't collapse, the priests don't pass out on the altar, and nobody drives a chariot through the sacred colonnade. In short, if something goes wrong, it's my fault. Picture the scene. The midday sun beats down like a blacksmith's hammer. The hippodrome is nothing more than a long strip of dirt, ringed with shaky wooden stands. Goats bleat from the hillside. Merchants bellow their prices as if they were calling for war. Someone is frying fish that died 3 days ago, and the stench travels faster than any runner. And into this chaos, we are supposed to inject noble athletic spirit. Delegates from every city-state have arrived, each one convinced that their traditions should dominate the games. The Spartans want more wrestling, the Athenians want the architecture of the souvenir stands improved, and the Corinthians just want to know where the wine is stored. To make matters worse, Emperor Nero has shown up. Yes, the emperor himself, in all his shining glory, claiming he will personally compete in every single event, including several that haven't even been invented yet. I have no doubt that if someone suggested competitive stone collecting while sitting very still, Nero would demand a laurel crown before the first pebble touched the ground. And of course, we have the sponsors. These games apparently cannot run on honor alone. Enter Storm Nectar Incorporated, the proud supplier of an energy potion that tastes suspiciously like warm horse saddle. Their owner insists that their brand must be mentioned 3 times per event, preferably accompanied by singing and dancing. Just yesterday, he made his servants paint slogans on old sheets and hang them around the stadium. So now, as I look out at the crowd, I see hand-painted banners proclaiming, "Storm Nectar, official fuel of Zeus. Buy 3 amphorae, get 1 goat free." Needless to say, this is not quite the solemn atmosphere Homer once described. Meanwhile, I try to create a schedule. The opening procession is supposed to march at dawn. By mid-morning, the drummers are still asleep. The priests are arguing about which hymn comes first, and the athletes are either lost in the market or refusing to put on the official cloaks. One messenger from Elis claims the torchbearer has disappeared entirely, eloped with a flute player. Accommodation is another nightmare. The official lodging apparently means that every visitor sleeps wherever they can find a patch of shade. Some snore inside temples, some collapse in alleyways, and at least 3 wrestlers broke into my own tent last night, claiming it was a public resting house. I woke up wedged between 2 of them, and I am still trying to wash the oil out of my hair. But worst of all is the creeping sense that none of this really matters. Do we honor Zeus? Do we unify the Hellenic world? Or are we simply putting on the largest traveling circus known to man? At moments, when the drums echo across the valley and the crowd roars, I almost feel the sacred fire of tradition. And then I remember that half the crowd is cheering because someone has set up a wine stand shaped like Poseidon. Still, there is something intoxicating about it. For all the chaos, for all the bickering and the dust, the games do bring everyone together, even if it is just to argue, gamble, or shout insults at strangers. The merchants get rich, the poets find inspiration, and the athletes, well, they usually end up with broken noses and no teeth, but at least someone writes an ode about them. I suppose that is why I keep going. Not because I believe in the glory of Greece, or because I trust Nero not to hijack the entire spectacle. No, I endure this because deep down, there is a twisted kind of pride in keeping the whole disaster from exploding. If at the end of the week only a handful of structures have burned down, I will consider it a personal triumph. So welcome, spectators. Sit back, find a comfortable spot on the splintered benches, and ignore the goat chewing on your sandal. Take a sip of storm nectar, if your stomach is strong enough, and prepare yourselves. You are about to witness the grandest, loudest, most catastrophically organized sporting festival in history. This is Olympia. These are the games, and I am the poor fool trying to hold it all together. Chapter 1: Parade Without Order. They told me an opening parade would be simple. Just line up the athletes, add some music, maybe a priest or two, and let them walk, they said, as if herding 100 half-naked men from 10 different city-states could ever resemble something simple. No, what we had on that morning was not a parade. It was a hostage situation where the hostages were also armed with egos the size of temples. The very first disaster of the day? The drummer. He was supposed to wake the entire camp with a steady beat that would echo across the valley, a thunderous reminder that the sacred games had begun. Instead, he was still passed out in his tent, smelling of cheap wine and bad decisions. When I finally dragged him out, he was so unsteady that 2 wrestlers had to carry him like a sack of grain. His first strike on the drum sounded less like divine thunder and more like a dying donkey's last breath. Then came the animals. The plan had been elegant on papyrus: 4 magnificent horses leading the front, followed by 2 solemn oxen pulling the ceremonial cart. The reality? One of the horses spooked at the sound of the donkey drum, bolted straight into the crowd, and the others followed like panicked children in a marketplace. Within seconds, stalls collapsed, fruit went flying, and one of the oxen somehow managed to wedge itself between 2 columns of the temple portico. Zeus must have been shaking his head above us. The athletes were no better. The Spartans, of course, were ready at dawn, oiled and glistening like bronze statues come to life. The Athenians, meanwhile, argued for an hour about whether their cloaks should be white, blue, or tastefully striped. They ended up compromising by forgetting half their garments entirely. The Corinthians simply wandered in drunk, which at least had the benefit of being efficient. And then there was Nero. Yes, Emperor Nero himself had decided that he, not Zeus's priest, should lead the procession. "I am a living god," he announced, chest out, chin high. The high priest argued for tradition, but Nero would not be denied. The solution? Both of them marched at the front, side by side, each trying to walk straighter and taller than the other. From a distance, it looked less like a sacred ceremony and more like an awkward speed-walking contest. When at last we got the line moving, the crowd cheered. At least some cheered, some booed, mostly depending on where their city's athletes had been placed in the order. One woman shouted, "Why is Megara so far back?" I bit my tongue before replying, "Because their captain spent all night lost in a vineyard." Instead, I smiled weakly and waved, pretending this was all part of the plan. Halfway through the route came the incident I had dreaded. One over-eager athlete, unidentified as he had long since discarded his cloak, decided the parade was the perfect time to demonstrate full Greek nudity. He tossed aside the last strip of fabric and strutted forward, arms raised like a victorious champion. The crowd howled, and I briefly considered resigning on the spot. Someone shouted, "It's tradition!" But I do not recall any papyrus scrolls demanding spontaneous streaking in the middle of a religious ceremony. And all the while, just behind me, the sponsor was having a fit. The proud owner of Storm Nectar sprinted along the line, demanding to know why his banners weren't more visible. "Where is my brand presence?" he bellowed. I explained that, in fact, giant cloth advertisements were not a customary part of Hellenic ritual. He disagreed, of course, and ordered his servants to scratch his slogans into the dirt path. Moments later, the sacred road was covered in phrases like, "Storm Nectar trademark, official drink of Zeus. One sip and you'll outrun Hermes." Naturally, half the crowd thought this was some sort of new competitive event and began drawing their own names into the sand. The result looked less like a holy procession and more like a chaotic graffiti festival. At the grand finale, when the parade was supposed to halt before Zeus's altar, the drummer collapsed again, his face pressed flat against the drumhead. The priests bickered over who would deliver the first prayer. Nero demanded that he sing an aria before any sacrifices could begin. "A historic performance," he cried, spreading his arms wide. I stared at him, then at the sweating athletes, then at the crowd, half drunk, half sunburned, and thought, yes, historic indeed. The kind of history people will try very hard to forget for, like 2,000 years. If the first half of the parade was a headache, the second half was a full-blown plague of frogs, locusts, and divine punishment rolled into one. The line was moving, or at least lurching in the right direction, but the crowd had now decided that they, not the priests, were the real entertainment. From the stands came a forest of homemade banners, each more ridiculous than the last. One man held up a plank of wood painted with charcoal that read, "Sparta rules, Athens drools." Even worse, a group of vendors had taken the sponsor's lead and scrawled their own ads. By the time we reached the halfway point, the procession route was lined with slogans like, "Buy Dino's olive oil, now with 30% less dirt." "Apollo loves cheese, eat more cheese." It was less an Olympic parade and more a farmer's market gone feral. The athletes, of course, responded in their own unique ways. The Spartans scowled at every banner that wasn't about them. The Athenians paused mid-step to critique the spelling. And then Nero naturally demanded more attention. Spotting the crowd's enthusiasm for banners, he ordered a servant to paint his likeness on a giant canvas and march it beside him. The problem? The servant was a terrible artist. Instead of the emperor's noble profile, the banner looked like a swollen turnip with eyes. The crowd howled with laughter. Nero, assuming they were delighted by his majesty, waved proudly. Meanwhile, the priests had grown restless. They were supposed to chant hymns, but the noise of the crowd drowned them out completely. In desperation, one priest climbed onto a cart and shouted, "Silence for Zeus," at the top of his lungs. The crowd responded by chanting back, "Zeus loves storm nectar," until the poor man nearly wept. I gave the signal to stop. The athletes stumbled into a rough semicircle. The priests shoved their way forward, and Nero climbed onto the altar itself, arms raised as if he were already a god. "I will now sing," he declared. The priest begged him to wait until after the sacrifice. The crowd begged him to never sing at all. But Nero was Nero. As he launched into a wailing aria about his divine beauty, the drummer passed out again face first into his instrument, producing a low, miserable hum that somehow became the accompaniment. A goat wandered onto the stage and bleated in perfect counterpoint. The crowd cheered as if it were all planned. And me? I stood at the edge of the chaos, watching this unholy mixture of sacred rite, drunken carnival, and accidental opera, and thought, this is only day one. 4 more to go. For the briefest moment, I allowed myself to imagine running away, hitching a ride on the next merchant cart, and never looking back. But then the sponsor caught my eye. He was grinning, pointing at the crowd as they chanted his product's name in unison. "Storm nectar! Storm nectar!" The man was radiant, basking in what he considered a marketing miracle. I realized with cold horror that the only person truly satisfied with this opening ceremony was the merchant selling saddle-flavored energy wine. And so the parade ended, not with solemn sacrifice or noble unity, but with an emperor howling off key, a crowd drunk on slogans, and a goat stealing offerings from the altar. I clutched my tablet, scribbled down the words, "Parade completed successfully," and told myself that technically, the opening ceremony was a success. But inside, I knew the truth. It was the beginning of the end.
Chapter 2, The Reporter's Angle. Good afternoon, dear citizens, and welcome to the grand spectacle of the Olympic Games. That was how I began my live commentary, standing on a wobbly wooden platform that swayed every time someone sneezed. My assignment: deliver noble, stirring descriptions of the day's events for posterity. The reality: shout over the chaos and hope the crowd didn't throw olives at me. From where I stood, I could see the opening of the first competitions. The athletes were stretching, or in some cases, drinking. A Spartan stripped down and oiled himself so aggressively that I feared he might slip out of existence altogether. The Athenian contingent was busy arguing over the angle at which the sun hit their cloaks. And the Corinthians, well, they had found the wine stand and decided to carb load with half a dozen amphorae. Today, I announced, we shall witness feats of strength, endurance, and a goat walked across my view, chewing what appeared to be a banner that once read, Sparta rules. I coughed into my speaking trumpet and pressed on. And feats of discipline, ladies and gentlemen. The first event on the schedule was the foot race. Simple enough, you'd think. Run in a straight line. Whoever arrives first wins. But this is Olympia, not common sense. The starter raised his hand. The crowd hushed, or at least shifted from screaming to a dull roar. The runners crouched low, dust swirling around them. At the signal, they leapt forward. Sand flew, muscles strained, and one poor fellow tripped on his own sandal strap, rolled twice, and decided to simply stay there, pretending it was all part of a strategic rest. Meanwhile, two others collided so hard they ended up wrestling each other mid-race. The Spartans claimed victory anyway. An exciting start, I boomed, pretending not to notice the audience's confusion. Truly, the gods smile upon these noble athletes. Behind me, someone shouted, "The gods are laughing at them," which, frankly, was a fairer assessment. The finish line was no less chaotic. The officials argued for several minutes about who had crossed first. One insisted it was the man who almost reached the line before collapsing. Another argued it was clearly the fellow who never left the starting block, but managed to look heroic while standing still. Eventually, in a stroke of genius, the judges declared all of them winners. The Spartans cheered. The Athenians demanded a recount. The Corinthians ordered more wine. Meanwhile, the sponsor was at it again. Storm nectar banners flapped across the stands, and the crowd had started chanting slogans spontaneously. "Outrun Hermes! Outrun Hermes!" they sang, even as one of the exhausted athletes vomited near the altar. I considered cutting my commentary short, but my scribe was already scratching every word onto papyrus, and apparently this nonsense will one day be considered historical record. May the gods forgive me. And then came the long jump. A simple test of distance, you might think. Line up, sprint, leap. But of course, nothing in Olympia is ever that simple. The first competitor sprinted magnificently, soared into the air, and landed directly on the official measuring rope, snapping it in half. The second slipped in the dust and belly flopped with such force that half the sandpit relocated to the front row of spectators. "Ladies and gentlemen," I proclaimed, doing my best to sound dignified, "what we are witnessing today is not merely sport, but art." My platform wobbled again, and I nearly toppled into the crowd. Yes, art of the highest order. The long jump fiasco left half the crowd coughing in dust, and the other half chewing on free samples of stolen lamb. But the show, as they say, must go on. I straightened my tunic, cleared my throat, and tried to inject gravitas back into my commentary. "Next," I declared, "comes the noble discus throw, a sport of precision and power, where—" A man behind me shouted, "Where somebody's going to get killed." Unfortunately, he wasn't wrong. The first competitor spun elegantly, released the discus with a mighty roar, and sent it soaring, straight into the sponsor's stall. Storm Nectar trademark amphorae exploded in every direction. The merchant's face went white, then red, then purple. He screamed something about brand sabotage, while the crowd cheered as if it had been intentional entertainment. The second athlete fared no better. He miscalculated his spin, let go too early, and the discus plopped anticlimactically into the dirt 2 paces away. The audience groaned, then burst into laughter, chanting, 2 steps, 2 steps, until the poor man slunk off in shame. But the third competitor, yes, he will live forever in infamy. He wound up with great flourish, spun faster, 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 until his loincloth came undone mid-rotation. The discus flew one way, his dignity flew the other. The crowd roared so loud I nearly lost my balance again. An unforgettable performance, I shouted, pretending not to notice that the discus had landed squarely in the lap of a high-ranking priest. By this point, my voice was hoarse. My papyrus scribe was laughing so hard he dropped his stylus, and the games were barely past their second event. But the schedule was merciless. Next came wrestling, a sport famed for its discipline, strength, and total disregard for personal space. 2 massive Spartans strode into the ring, oiled like statues glistening under the sun. The crowd hushed in anticipation. With a thunderous clap, they grappled. Muscle against muscle, pride against pride. For a moment, it looked like an actual contest. Then one slipped on a discarded amphora shard, both toppled over, and somehow managed to pin the referee instead. The audience screamed with delight. "Referee wins! Referee wins!" they chanted. I dutifully recorded the result. And yet, amid the chaos, there were flashes, tiny, fleeting flashes of actual skill. A young athlete from Delphi executed a flawless takedown, clean as any in legend. For half a breath, the crowd gasped in admiration. Then the goat wandered back into the arena, ate the corner of his victory banner, and the moment was gone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I croaked into my trumpet, "what you are witnessing today is history in the making. Not the kind of history sung in odes, perhaps, but the kind that will keep tavern storytellers employed for decades." The sun dipped lower, the dust thickened, and my wooden platform creaked dangerously with each sway of the chanting mob. My final thought before collapsing onto my stool was this: if the first day of competition looked like this, then by Zeus I may not survive to narrate the last. But the crowd? They were delirious, chanting, cheering, waving their absurd banners high. "Free wine for referees!" "Storm Nectar. Stronger than Sparta." I buried my face in my hands. Posterity, it seems, would have plenty to laugh about.
Chapter 3, The Sponsor's Fury. If you ask me, these games would be nothing without Storm Nectar trademark. Nothing. Do you think people travel from every corner of Greece to watch sweaty men run in circles? Nope. They come because Storm Nectar trademark has transformed the games into a brand experience. At least, that's what I told my investors. And yet here I stand, surrounded by chaos, wondering why my carefully crafted marketing strategy is being treated like last year's goat droppings. The opening parade was supposed to be our moment of triumph. 10 servants carried banners, each hand-painted with our glorious logo. I paid extra for the lettering, bold strokes, sharp lines, something that screamed power. What did the crowd do? They laughed. They pointed at the official Drink of Zeus slogan and started chanting it as a joke. I wanted reverence. I got parody. Granted, it was loud parody, but still. Then came the foot race. Perfect opportunity, I thought. Athletes sprinting, sweat glistening, mouths dry. Nothing sells better than thirst. I positioned my sellers at the finish line, amphorae ready, cups brimming. What happened? The athletes collapsed before they even reached us. One poor fool vomited right beside the stand. Not exactly the testimonial I was hoping for. Still, I am a businessman. Adaptability is key. Turn it into a slogan, I told my scribes. By the next race, we had banners waving, "Drink Storm Nectar, vomit less. Stay on your feet with Storm Nectar trademark." Then disaster struck during the discus throw. The very first competitor hurled his discus straight into my stand. Amphorae shattered. Liquid gold splashed across the sand, and my profits leaked into the earth like a sacrifice to Hades. I screamed for compensation, but the judges waved me off. "Accidents happen," they said. Accidents. That was inventory worth a month's revenue. I nearly demanded that the athlete drink the puddle he'd created, but apparently that's not dignified. The second throw was no better. 2 steps, just 2 miserable steps, before the discus dropped. The crowd laughed, but nobody thought to buy a refreshing drink. And then came the true humiliation. The third thrower spinning, 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 until his loincloth flew away like a sacrificial dove. The crowd roared, the discus flew, and where did it land? Right in the lap of a priest. The laughter was deafening, but worst of all, people began chanting, "Storm Nectar trademark keeps you covered," as if my product were some sort of clothing line. I buried my face in my hands and prayed for lightning to strike. Still, I clung to hope. Wrestling was next, and wrestling is sweaty business. Sweat equals thirst. Thirst equals sales. I positioned my vendors right beside the ring, cups glinting in the sunlight. This time, surely the athletes would drink, but no. The wrestlers slipped on an amphora shard and crushed the referee instead. Nobody noticed the perfectly chilled storm nectar just a few paces away. My vendors might as well have been invisible, and yet, even in this pit of despair, I see opportunity. Every chant, every joke, every parody, still they are shouting my brand. When they laugh, they say my name. When they jeer, they say my name. When the goat wanders past, chewing my last intact banner, the crowd points and shouts, "Storm Nectar Goat!" Do you understand what this means? Immortality. Yes, perhaps they mock today, but tomorrow they will crave it. I had expected wrestling to bring redemption, a showcase of sweat, muscle, and glorious exhaustion, prime conditions for a refreshing gulp of Storm Nectar trademark. Instead, the crowd spent more time chanting, "Referee wins," than buying anything. Not a single cup sold. I nearly wept into my ledger. But then came the so-called combat sports, boxing and pancration. Here, surely, I thought, the athletes would be parched. What better way to recover from being punched repeatedly in the face than with a cold, revitalizing drink? My vendors stood ready, cups gleaming like liquid gold. The first match began with one fighter landing a spectacular blow that flattened his opponent in seconds. The crowd went wild. My vendor rushed forward with a sample shouting, "Storm Nectar trademark, heal like a hero." The unconscious athlete, sadly, could not respond. The victor refused the cup as well, insisting he only drank pure spring water of Mount Helicon. Spring water, can you believe it? No branding, no flavor, no marketing plan whatsoever, just water. The second match descended into chaos immediately. The fighters pummeled each other with such ferocity that the referee abandoned the ring and joined the crowd. When the dust cleared, both competitors collapsed in a heap. The crowd roared with approval. And what did they chant? Did they chant, "Buy Storm Nectar"? Oh no, they chanted, both dead," which was factually inaccurate, but far more entertaining. By this point, I was trembling with rage. My servants tiptoed around me, terrified to deliver the sales figures. 2 cups sold, both to a goat herder who mistook them for cheap wine. 2 cups. After I had invested half a fortune, bribed officials, and even convinced Nero himself to mention my product in his opening area. Granted, he forgot the name halfway through and called it Storm something or other, but the intent was there. And then came the real humiliation. The crowd invented their own slogans. They painted them on scraps of cloth. They carved them into planks. They shouted them from the stands. Do you know what I saw waving above the hippodrome yesterday? Storm Nectar, now with 20% less goat hair. Drink Storm Nectar because water is for losers. They cheered these slogans louder than any I had paid for. They loved mocking me, and yet every syllable still carried my product's name. My marketing advisors would call that organic reach. I called it personal torment. And still deep down, a tiny spark of hope burned, because even in their jeers, even in their laughter, they could not stop shouting it. Storm nectar, storm nectar, storm nectar, like thunder rolling across the valley. Perhaps one day they will forget the accidents, the broken amphora, the goat chewing my last banner. Perhaps they will forget that the discus turned my stall into rubble. Perhaps they will even forget that one athlete vomited directly onto a crate of samples. But they will not forget the name. And in business, immortality is worth every humiliation. So let the priests sing, let Nero preen, let the athletes collapse in disgrace. The games will end, but the memory of storm nectar will remain. Echoing in every tavern, carved on every bench, shouted in every alleyway. Mock me if you wish, laugh until your sides split. In the end, when thirst burns your throat and dust fills your lungs, you will remember one thing: storm nectar, trademark, official drink of Zeus.
Chapter 4: The Organizer's Breakdown. I should have known the first day was too much. A man can only watch so many athletes run the wrong way. So many priests argue over incense. So many goats wander into sacred ceremonies before something inside him begins to snap. And snap I did, sometime around dawn of the second day, when I discovered that half the wrestling team had used the official altar as their personal sleeping mat. Imagine my horror. There they were, sprawled like exhausted pigs, drooling on the very stones meant for Zeus himself. One had even carved his initials into the corner, SP, which could only mean Sparta. The Spartans swore it wasn't them. The Athenians blamed the Corinthians. The Corinthians, predictably, denied everything while sipping wine from a ceremonial chalice. I, meanwhile, counted the gray hairs sprouting from my scalp. The schedule was simple: more foot races, followed by the long jump, discus, and the dreaded pancration. But in practice, nothing was ever simple. The runners were supposed to line up at sunrise. Instead, they staggered in after breakfast, eyes bloodshot, some still smelling of cheap wine and storm nectar samples. I shouted until my voice cracked, but they only grinned at me as if my rage were a comedy routine. Listen carefully, I told them. You run from that line to that line. Straight, no detours, no wrestling, no scenic tours of the marketplace. They nodded solemnly, and for one fleeting moment I thought, perhaps today will be better. Of course, it wasn't. At the signal, the runners shot forward. Most of them, anyway. Two sprinted heroically, another tripped, and one particularly confused fellow decided to stop halfway and deliver an impromptu speech about civic pride. Athens forever, he cried before collapsing from exhaustion. I slammed my head against my tablet. Then came the long jump. Yesterday it had been dust and belly flops. Today it was sabotage. One competitor sprinkled oil across the takeoff board, sending the next man skidding face first into the sandpit. The crowd roared with approval, while the priest muttered about divine wrath. I muttered too, mostly about the wrath I intended to unleash when this was over. And then the discus. I had begged them to be careful. Do not throw toward the crowd, I said. Do not throw toward the altar. Do not throw toward the sponsor's stand. Naturally, the very first discus veered directly into the sponsor's stand. Again. Storm nectar splashed everywhere. The merchant shrieked, tearing at his tunic like a man possessed. The crowd thought it was part of the show and applauded wildly. By this point, my sanity was slipping. Every event felt like a personal assault on my health. The crowd waved their banners, chanting ridiculous slogans. One read, Our goat jumps farther than you. Another, pancreation or we riot. I wanted to tear them down myself, but the guards insisted it would damage the festival atmosphere. And so I endured, watching as my carefully prepared schedule dissolved into dust and mockery. The sun climbed higher, my voice grew hoarse, and my soul grew weary. The games were meant to honor the gods, but I could only pray that Zeus was too busy hurling lightning elsewhere to notice what we were doing in his name. By midday, the heat was brutal, pounding down like a hammer on an anvil, and I was already dizzy from shouting. But the schedule demanded more, always more. The next event, pancreation, the terrifying blend of wrestling and boxing with the helpful rule of anything goes except biting, which of course meant that everyone would immediately start biting. I gathered the competitors, 20 hulking brutes who looked less like athletes and more like escaped bears. Gentlemen, I croaked, this is a contest of skill, of discipline, of. But before I could finish, one of them spat into the dirt, and another flexed until his veins bulged like overripe grapes. They were not listening. They were already measuring which bones they would break first. The crowd was restless, chanting, stomping, waving their absurd banners. New slogans had appeared since the morning. Blood for Zeus. Pancreation. Better than prayer. I covered my ears. Surely the gods themselves could hear this mockery echoing up the mountainside. The first match began, and within moments one fighter had driven his opponent headfirst into the sand. The man lay there twitching, and the crowd roared as if Zeus himself had descended. I turned to the priests, desperate for guidance. They simply shrugged and muttered, "At least it's entertaining." The second match was worse. Two men locked arms, straining, grunting, their muscles shining with sweat. Then one grabbed the other's hair and yanked so hard the poor man screamed like a goat at slaughter. The referee leapt in, trying to restore order, and promptly received a fist to the jaw. Meanwhile, the sponsor, curse his soul, was ecstatic. Every time a fighter collapsed, his vendors rushed forward with samples of Storm Nectar trademark. "Drink like a champion," they shouted, splashing sticky liquid onto unconscious bodies. The crowd loved it, shrieking with laughter, and the sponsor basked in their mockery as though it were gold. I felt my mind fraying, my vision swam, my heart pounded. I leaned on my wax tablet like a crutch and muttered prayers to any god who might still be listening. "Please," I whispered, "just let one event go smoothly." The gods answered, but not as I had hoped. As the final match began, a cloud passed before the sun, plunging the arena into sudden shadow. The crowd gasped. A rumble of thunder rolled in the distance. "Zeus speaks," someone shouted. "Zeus demands more blood." The fighters took this as divine encouragement and immediately doubled their violence, clawing and pummeling like wild animals. Dust rose in choking waves. The crowd stamped their feet in frenzy. Someone lit torches. Others banged amphorae together like drums. I clutched my temples. My knees buckled. The priests were powerless, the referees unconscious, and the sponsor beaming like a man-crowned king. When at last the final combatant collapsed, limp and broken, I croaked the words "match over" with what little voice I had left. The crowd didn't care. They surged onto the field, hoisting the victor, half dead though he was, onto their shoulders as if he were a hero descended from legend. And me? I staggered back, my vision dark at the edges, my sanity a thread ready to snap. These games were meant to honor Zeus, but I feared they were summoning Hades instead. I scribbled on my wax tablet with shaking hands. Day 2 complete. Organizer still alive. Barely.
Chapter 5, The Reporter's Angle, Day 2. Ladies and gentlemen, honored listeners across the ages, welcome back to another thrilling day at the Olympic Games. That was my opening line. I shouted it with all the confidence of a man who absolutely did not believe a single word he was saying. My speaking trumpet wobbled in the hot air. My scribe was already sighing before I'd even finished the sentence. Yesterday had been chaos, true, but today promised, well, more chaos. The Pancratian had nearly destroyed half the arena. The priests were still nursing bruises, and the sponsor was prancing about like a peacock, convinced that every shout of storm nectar was genuine devotion rather than ridicule. But my job, my noble calling, was to describe it all as if the gods themselves had scripted every moment. The first contest of the morning, the javelin throw. A pure and simple test of skill, I assured the listeners. Straight line, steady arm, precise aim. In theory, at least. The first competitor took his stance, eyes narrow, muscles taut. He hurled the javelin high and true, directly into the announcer's platform. My platform. The spear lodged inches from my leg. I pretended to smile. An impressive start, ladies and gentlemen, aimed directly at your humble narrator. The crowd roared with laughter. My scribe muttered something about hazard pay. The second thrower fumbled his grip entirely. The javelin slipped from his hand and flopped into the dirt like a dead fish. The poor athlete tried to retrieve the weapon with dignity, but dignity dies quickly when small children are hurling olives at your back. The third competitor at least threw in the right direction, but so far off target that the javelin speared the sponsor's last intact banner. Storm nectar fluttered pitifully in the breeze, impaled for all to see. The merchant's howl could be heard as far as Corinth. The crowd loved it. They chanted, storm skewer, and waved their cups of watered wine like maniacs. Truly, I announced, a demonstration of both strength and, creativity. My voice cracked on the last word. Next came the jump with weights, a peculiar event where athletes clutch small lead halteres in their hands to swing themselves farther. It was supposed to showcase grace and technique. Instead, it showcased gravity's merciless efficiency. The first jumper tripped on his own halteres and face-planted before leaving the ground. The second actually leapt, but forgot to let go of the weights, crashing down in a heap that made the sandpit shudder. The third, however, was the true innovator. He hurled his halteres into the crowd before jumping, striking a merchant square in the head. The merchant dropped like a sack of figs. The crowd roared with approval. "Double score!" someone shouted. I, meanwhile, was beginning to despair. My voice rasped. My tunic clung with sweat, and my notes had devolved into frantic scrawls like "man fell again" and "goat ate more banners." My scribe was no better. His papyrus was stained with tears of laughter. Still, duty called. "What we are witnessing," I croaked, "is the eternal glory of Greek athletics. Future generations will sing of this." My words were immediately drowned out by the crowd chanting, "Goat, G-O-A-T, goat," as the infamous animal returned to steal another discarded cloak. By this point, the arena resembled less an Olympic festival and more a traveling comedy troupe. Yet the people were ecstatic, drunk on spectacle, dust, and cheap wine. Every blunder drew cheers, every accident a new chant. And through it all, I kept talking, kept pretending it was noble, because if I stopped, if I admitted the truth, I might just laugh myself into madness. The sun beat down on the arena like a blacksmith's hammer, and my voice was already cracking. But there was no mercy in the schedule. Next came the hoplitodromos, The armed race, where athletes ran in full armor carrying heavy shields, a stirring reminder of military discipline, at least in theory. The signal was given. The armored runners charged forward, if you can call it charging. The first man tripped immediately, his shield bouncing off his helmet with a clang so loud the crowd winced. The second stumbled over him. The third collapsed from heat after 10 steps, and suddenly the race looked less like a contest and more like a pile of overturned tortoises. One particularly inspired spectator unfurled a new sheet painted with the words, "Armor is for cowards, run naked." The runners struggled, shields clanging, helmets rolling across the dirt. A Corinthian gave up entirely, sat down mid-track, and demanded wine. When a vendor handed him a cup of storm nectar, he spat it out dramatically. The crowd cheered even louder. The sponsor shrieked and tore at his hair. I could not decide which was funnier. I leaned into my tumpet, forcing out words between gasps of dusty air. A magnificent display of stamina, ladies and gentlemen, true warriors of Greece. In truth, it looked like children playing at soldiers in a sandbox. And then, finally, the chariot races, the thunder of hooves, the pride of every city-state, the centerpiece of the games. 10 teams lined up, horses snorting, wheels rattling. Nero himself descended into the arena, resplendent in robes, declaring he would lead the charge. The crowd went wild. Banners shot up everywhere, slogans freshly painted in clumsy letters. "Go Nero, go!" "Zeus rides shotgun." "Storm nectar trademark. Fuel your horses too." The horns sounded and the chariots surged forward. Dust erupted in great clouds. The ground trembled and my heart pounded. For a few shining seconds, it almost looked majestic, until the first collision. 2 chariots tangled wheels and toppled instantly. The crowd screamed with delight. Nero pushed ahead, urging his horses, until one shied at the wreckage. His chariot lurched sideways, and with theatrical grace, the emperor was flung headfirst into the sand. I nearly dropped my reed in shock. The crowd gasped, then erupted into hysterical laughter. "Long live Nero!" they screamed as if the tumble were a planned stunt. And then came the absurdity of absurdities. The safety chariot. 2 grim-faced spearmen rolled out onto the track, driving slowly, deliberately, blocking anyone from overtaking. Their orders were clear: hold the field until Nero could mount a fresh team. The crowd roared with mockery and chants. "Slower, slower," and "Turtle Chariot." Minutes dragged on, horses stamped impatiently, drivers cursed, wheels splintered. But eventually Nero reappeared, radiant in dust and sweat, a new team of horses at his command. The safety chariot pulled aside. The race resumed, and as fate or politics would have it, every other driver mysteriously faltered. Some crashed, some slowed, some appeared to be persuaded by the spearmen's pointed encouragement. And so Nero thundered across the finish line, arms spread, claiming victory to a crowd both jeering and cheering at once. Laurels were placed upon his head. Trumpets blared off key. The sponsor scrambled to thrust a cup of storm nectar into his hands, which Nero promptly spilled down his chest, declaring it nectar fit for emperors. The merchant nearly fainted from joy. I leaned against my wobbling platform, exhausted. "There you have it, dear listeners," I croaked. "History has been made today. Not the kind sung in odes, perhaps, but the kind drunken poets will never tire of." And so ended the second day. For the athletes, exhaustion. For the sponsor, vindication. For Nero, false triumph. And for me, the humble reporter, a sore throat, ringing ears, and the bitter knowledge that tomorrow would be even worse.
Chapter 6. The Sponsor Strikes Back. If anyone still doubted it, yesterday's chariot race proved once and for all that storm nectar is destiny, When Nero himself, Emperor of Rome, spilled it down his chest in front of 20,000 screaming fans, he transformed my humble product into liquid divinity. Was it graceful? Nope. Did he drink a single drop? Also number. But did the crowd chant the name? Oh, yes. And that, my friends, is immortality. This morning, I strode into the hippodrome with renewed confidence, chest out, tunic freshly pressed. My competitors, those pathetic wine sellers and goat milk hawkers, glared at me with envy. I almost pitied them. Almost. Their stalls smelled of sour grapes and curdled dairy. My stall? A shining altar to success, piled high with amphorae, painted in gleaming red letters, Storm Nectar trademark, official drink of Zeus. Sales, however, remained disappointing. My servants whispered that yesterday, amid all the chanting, we had sold exactly 6 cups. 6? That is not a sales figure. It is a cruel joke. I dismissed the servants on the spot, replacing them with a new team of brand ambassadors. They were instructed to shout slogans, hand out samples, and if necessary, physically pour Storm Nectar down the throats of unconscious athletes. We are in the business of visibility, not dignity. The morning's first contest was archery. A perfect opportunity, I thought, aim, precision, victory, all qualities associated with Storm Nectar trademark. I ordered my ambassadors to stand directly behind the targets, holding banners. The judges objected, muttering about safety and common sense, but I silenced them with a generous bribe. The first arrow whizzed past the bullseye and straight through a banner, slicing the trademark clean off my logo. The second arrow skewered an amphora, spraying sticky liquid over the sand. The third competitor, bless him, fired so wide that he impaled one of my ambassadors in the sleeve. He staggered theatrically, shouting, "By Storm Nectar, strong enough to stop an arrow." The audience erupted in applause. I wept with pride. As the sun climbed, the contests grew fiercer. The athletes sweated, the crowd howled, and my ambassadors scurried like ants, thrusting cups at anyone who stumbled near. One unfortunate runner vomited immediately after drinking, and the mob chanted, "Storm Nectar cleans," as if it were some sacred ritual. My competitors would have been humiliated. Me? I scratched the phrase into my marketing tablet for future use. Yes, let them laugh, let them mock. They cannot stop shouting my name. And tomorrow, when their throats are dry and their heads ache, whose drink will they crave? Not wine, not water, mine. Storm Nectar, nectar of victory, juice of Zeus. The archery debacle might have rattled a lesser man, but not me. No, I am forged from bronze, polished by ambition, and carbonated with destiny. I knew the afternoon events would give Storm Nectar the stage it deserved. If the athletes wouldn't buy, the crowd would. If the crowd mocked, so be it. The louder the mockery, the deeper my brand carved itself into memory. Next came the discus finals, a noble test of strength and elegance, perfectly aligned with the Storm Nectar trademark image. I had stationed ambassadors along the edge of the field with trays of amphorae, their tunics emblazoned with my logo. It was foolproof. It was not foolproof. The very first thrower spun so furiously that his discus flew wide, clipping an ambassador on the head. The poor man crumpled like a rag doll, but, bless his training, he shouted "Storm Nectar" as he fell. The crowd roared with laughter, repeating it in unison. My fallen ambassador was carried out like a martyr, and I swear some in the audience were wiping tears of joy. The second discus shattered an amphora, spraying the first 3 rows in sticky sweetness. For a moment, panic, then delight. The spectators began scooping handfuls of dirt-soaked drink into their mouths, chanting, "Free samples." I had not authorized this marketing stunt, but Zeus himself could not have bought such exposure. After discus came the dreaded pancration semifinals, the most brutal of contests. I had prepared carefully free samples for winners, discount vouchers for losers, a special chant sheet distributed among the audience. It all fell apart immediately. Two fighters locked into a vicious grapple, rolling through the sand like wild boars. A vendor rushed forward with a cup of Storm Nectar trademark. One fighter seized it, hurled the liquid into his opponent's eyes, and then smashed the amphora over his head. The second bout was no better. Both fighters ignored each other entirely and charged my stand instead, demanding free drinks before they continued. I considered it for a moment. Two champions drinking on the field could have been good publicity, but then one belched so loudly the crowd laughed him out of the arena. My brand, once again, became the punchline. By the time the finals approached, I was trembling. Dust swirled, blood stained the sand, priests muttered prayers for order. My ambassadors still ran frantically, pressing cups into unwilling hands. The crowd, drunk on wine, sweat, and hysteria, waved new homemade banners. Punch harder, drink faster, now with 30% more violence. The chanting was deafening. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the ledger, the columns of profit, the graphs rising like temples to heaven. Instead, I saw broken amphorae and goats chewing on my last intact sign. And then came salvation, or what I chose to call salvation. A fighter collapsed mid-match, flat on his back, gasping for air. My ambassador seized the moment, poured Storm Nectar trademark straight into his mouth. The man sputtered, coughed, then leapt to his feet, roaring like Ares himself. He smashed his opponent down in seconds, victorious. The crowd lost its collective mind. "From dead to dread!" someone shrieked. They carried the fighter out on their shoulders, cup still clutched in his hand, liquid dripping down his chin. I wept. Not from sorrow this time, but from joy. Finally, proof. Storm Nectar could be spun as divine miracle. Of course, the priests objected immediately. "Only Zeus grants life," they cried, demanding the fighter's victory be annulled. The crowd booed them mercilessly. One even threw an empty amphora, striking a priest's headdress and knocking it sideways. For once, the mob was on my side. I had outshone the priests. My drink was more convincing than their prayers. As the sun sank, the air thick with dust and sweat, I stood amidst the wreckage of my stall and felt oddly triumphant. Sales remained abysmal. True. My inventory was in shards, my ambassadors bruised, my slogans twisted beyond recognition. But the people, by gods, the people could not stop shouting my nectar. So let the athletes collapse. Let the referees bleed. Let the priests shake their fists at the heavens. The games belong to chaos, and chaos, it seems, belongs to me. Storm Nectar trademark, official drink of Zeus.
Chapter 7. The Organizer's Breaking Point. I awoke to the sound of shouting, not the usual morning chaos of vendors haggling or athletes arguing over cloaks, but something far worse, an entire section of the crowd chanting in unison before dawn. I stumbled from my tent, bleary-eyed, only to hear the words that would haunt me forever. "Storm Nectar! Storm Nectar!" They were already at it. Before the drums, before the sacrifices, before I had even rubbed the dust from my eyes, the mob was chanting the sponsor's name. My temples throbbed. I was the organizer of a sacred festival, and somehow I had become the warm-up act for a saddle-flavored energy drink. The day's schedule loomed before me like a death sentence. More foot races, more jumps, more ways for athletes to humiliate themselves while I aged a decade with every heartbeat. I tried to gather the officials, but half were still drunk, and the other half had joined the chanting. "Focus!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "We honor Zeus today!" Not some merchant syrup, but the crowd only grew louder, and the sponsor himself appeared on a gilded cart, throwing amphora shards into the stands like confetti. The first race of the morning began disastrously. The runners lined up, squinting into the rising sun. At the signal, they bolted forward, but one immediately tripped over a discarded banner, another veered into the crowd, and a third stopped mid-track to adjust his hair. The finish line judge raised his hands in despair and declared, "Everyone tied." The mob erupted in cheers, waving their new slogan, "Lose fast, drink faster." I gritted my teeth so hard I feared they might shatter. Next came the long jump finals. Yesterday it had been comical, but today it was catastrophic. One athlete sprinted magnificently, leapt into the air, and landed squarely on the official measuring rope, snapping it in half. The crowd cheered as though it were deliberate. Another slipped in the dust and tumbled head over heels, crashing into the sponsor's stall. The third jumper at least cleared the pit, but so far that he landed in the lap of a high-ranking magistrate. The man toppled backwards, robes flying, dignity in tatters. The mob invented a new chant on the spot. "Magistrate! Magistrate!" They roared with laughter until the poor official fled, face red as pomegranate juice. And through it all, I scribbled notes with shaking hands. My wax tablet was covered in angry scratches. Goats loose again, priests sulking, sponsor delirious, crowd unhinged. I felt like a doctor documenting the slow death of a patient too stubborn to expire. When the discus began, I nearly bolted from the arena. I could not endure another shattered amphora, another ruined banner, another slogan twisted into mockery. And yet I stayed, rooted by duty, or perhaps by sheer madness. The first discus sailed clean, landing safely in the sandpit. The second as well. For a heartbeat, hope flickered in my chest. Perhaps order was returning. Then the third competitor spun too fast, lost control, and hurled his discus straight into the sacred altar. The priest screamed, the crowd cheered, and I buried my face in my hands. "Blasphemy!" someone cried. "Brilliant marketing!" shouted the sponsor. The mob invented another slogan instantly. "Even Zeus drinks storm nectar." And just when I thought the humiliation could not deepen, a boy in the stands stood up holding a crudely painted plank. On it, in smeared letters, was written, "Organizer needs storm nectar too." Kilroy was here. The crowd roared with laughter. They began pointing at me, chanting it louder and louder until my ears burned. My knees buckled, my vision swam, and I realized that I had ceased to be the master of ceremonies. I had become part of the entertainment. A clown, a prop, a walking punchline for an audience drunk on chaos. And I had serious questions. Why would I need storm nectar? Who is Kilroy? Where did he come from? What did he do here? Why did he leave? What do I do here? Why don't I leave? Why don't we all leave? But nobody gave me answers, so I staggered away from the field, clutching my tablet like a shield, muttering prayers that the day would somehow, mercifully, end before my sanity did. The afternoon sun baked the arena until even the stones seemed to sweat. My tunic clung to me like wet parchment. My throat rasped, and still the schedule dragged on. The crowd was louder than ever, a sea of painted banners and drunken chants, none of which honored Zeus or the athletes. Every last shout carried that cursed name, Storm Nectar trademark. I forced the athletes into line for the hoplitodromos, the armored race. They clanked forward, helmets askew, shields dented, like children playing war with pots and pans. At the signal, they charged, or tried to. One man tripped instantly. Another dropped his shield, and soon the track was littered with groaning bodies. The crowd erupted, waving new banners. "Fall faster with Storm Nectar trademark!" My teeth ground together. These races were meant to honor the gods, not provide slogans for merchants. Next came the finals of the javelin. I prayed, genuinely prayed, that at least one throw might land clean. The first athlete hurled his spear strong and true, and for an instant I dared hope. Then it veered sideways, skewering a merchant's cart full of figs. The vendor wailed, the crowd howled, and children dove for free fruit. The second thrower launched his javelin so far off target it flew into the stands, striking a banner that read, "Organizer forfeits." The plank snapped in two, the chant rose again, and I thought I might collapse. The third thrower at least landed in the sandpit, but directly on top of a goat, which squealed in outrage and chased him from the field. "Ladies and gentlemen," I whispered to no one in particular, "we are doomed." By the time the pancration finals began, the arena was a madhouse. Fighters snarled, priests fretted, the sponsor paraded about as if crowned king. My officials had lost all authority. Even the referees joined in the crowd's chanting. When the first fighter collapsed, the sponsor's ambassadors rushed in, pouring storm nectar into his mouth. The man sprang up, fists flying, and the mob exploded. "Resurrection drink! Resurrection drink!" I staggered back, clutching my tablet. I wanted to write the truth, that order was lost, and that the games had become a circus. But my stylus trembled too much to form the letters. My thoughts spiraled. What if this is what they wanted all along? What if the gods themselves delight in chaos? And then the final insult. As the sun dipped low, Nero himself appeared once more, strutting onto the field, declaring he would perform a victory ode. "History shall remember this day," he cried. The crowd roared approval, chanting his name, but even their chant twisted back to mockery. "Nero, Nero, storm nectar, hero!" I dropped my stylus. My knees gave way. I knelt in the dust as Nero's off-key aria echoed, as the sponsor basked in glory, as the mob howled its madness to the heavens. And in that moment I knew the games were no longer mine to control. They belonged to the crowd, to the chaos, to the drink. Just when I thought the madness could not stretch further, the heavens themselves decided to intervene. A low rumble rolled across the valley, thunder echoing from the hills. The priests leapt to their feet, arms raised. "Zeus speaks!" they cried. For a heartbeat, the crowd fell silent, waiting for a sign of divine displeasure. And then from the stands, a drunken voice shouted, "Storm nectar trademark! The sound of Zeus!" The silence shattered. The mob roared with laughter, pounding the benches until the whole arena shook. A new chant burst forth, "Zeus sponsors the games." The sponsor naturally raised both hands in triumph, as though he had orchestrated the storm itself. He bellowed that every clap of thunder was proof of storm, nectar's heavenly approval. The mob believed him, or pretended to. At this point, it hardly mattered. I scrawled one final note on my tablet, letters jagged and broken. Day 3, organizer defeated. Chapter 9, the organizer's last stand. At dawn of the fourth day, I awoke, expecting more chaos, more goats, more storm nectar, trademark chants rattling in my ears. And yes, the banners still waved, the sponsor still strutted, the mob still jeered. But something was different. There was a hush in the air, a nervous tension, as if even the gods themselves had grown weary of the endless buffoonery. The schedule was mercifully short. Final rounds in the foot race, discus, and wrestling. Just 3 events to survive. I told myself that if the athletes could manage one single moment of dignity, the games might yet limp toward respectability. My heart was brittle with hope. The first race lined up under a blazing sky. I expected the usual: tripping, vomiting, goats. But when the horn sounded, they ran. They actually ran. Feet pounding, sand flying, bodies straining forward. No speeches mid-track, no detours into the stands, no random collapse at the starting line. They ran like athletes, like champions, like men who remembered at last why they had come. The crowd, stunned into silence, actually cheered without mockery. And when one Spartan surged across the finish line ahead of the rest, the judges declared him winner without argument. For the first time in days, I felt tears sting my eyes. The discus followed. My soul trembled with dread, memories of shattered stalls and skewered banners still raw. But the first thrower stepped into the ring, spun with measured grace, and released. The discus cut through the air like a silver moon, landing cleanly in the pit. The crowd gasped, then applauded. No jokes, no chants, no slogans. The second followed, then the third. Not perfect, not flawless, but competent. I clutched my tablet, scribbling furiously, daring to believe that order might be reborn. And then came wrestling. Two athletes, stripped and oiled, faced one another in the dust. They grappled, strained, pushed, pulled, but with skill, not farce. No slipping on amphora shards, no pinning of referees, no goats wandering in to eat the banners. Just strength against strength, discipline against discipline. When one man toppled the other with a clean throw, the crowd rose to its feet in genuine applause. No mocking slogans, no laughter, only respect. For a moment, just a fragile, fleeting moment, the games were beautiful. I looked to the priests, who stood straighter now, their faces glowing with pride. I looked to the athletes, chests heaving, eyes bright with honor. And I looked to the crowd, who for once were not jeering or chanting nonsense, but clapping in steady rhythm, a hymn of human admiration. My heart swelled. Perhaps we had not failed entirely. Perhaps Zeus would forgive us. And then, of course, the sponsor climbed onto the platform, waving his arms, shouting that it was all thanks to Storm Nectar trademark. The mob howled with laughter, the spell shattered, and once again the arena dissolved into chaos. But for that one precious hour, I swear to you, the games were everything they were meant to be. For one blessed hour, I had believed in miracles. But miracles, like amphorae, are fragile things. By the time the crowd had finished laughing at the sponsor's latest outburst, my fragile hope was already cracking. Still, I resolved to cling to it. This was the final day of competition. If I could shepherd the last events to their conclusion without catastrophe, perhaps the games could be remembered not as a circus, but as something close to noble. The afternoon began with the long jump finals. I walked the pit myself, smoothing the sand with trembling hands, whispering prayers under my breath. I banned goats from the arena, stationed guards at every entrance, and threatened to exile anyone who brought food into the stands. No distractions, I muttered. Not today. The first jumper ran, swung his halteres, and leapt. He landed smoothly in the center of the pit, raising a small spray of dust. The crowd clapped politely. No chants, no slogans, no mockery. My heart leapt higher than he had. The second jumper followed with equal composure, his landing solid and sure. The third, not perfect. He stumbled slightly, but he remained upright, dignity intact. The crowd still applauded. For the first time in days, my notes were free of curses. I wrote, clean jumps, respectful audience, perhaps redemption. Next came the javelin. I admit my palms sweated. The memory of skewered banners and terrified goats still haunted me. I paced the field, barking at the athletes to focus, to breathe, to aim. They nodded solemnly, and then they threw. One after another, javelins cut the air, gleaming in the sun, thudding safely into the sand. Not a single vendor skewered, not a single banner impaled. The crowd, amazed, began clapping in rhythm. Slow, steady, reverent. My heart ached with relief. Perhaps the gods themselves had intervened. But I knew the true test remained. The closing wrestling match, the grand finale before the game's end. Two men entered the arena, each bearing scars from earlier contests, each glistening with oil and pride. They bowed to Zeus's altar, then faced one another in silence. The grapple began. Their bodies locked, muscles straining, dust rising. The crowd hushed, not cheering, not mocking, but watching with reverence. Every shift of weight, every push and pull was a contest of equals. Minutes passed, Sweat poured, arms trembled. My heart pounded with each movement. And then, clean as any tale of heroes, the final throw. One man lifted the other, twisted, and brought him down with a crash that shook the arena. The victor roared, the defeated clasped his hand, and for a heartbeat the entire stadium erupted in genuine admiration. Not laughter, not slogans, but applause. True applause, thundering like rain on the roof of a temple. Tears blurred my vision. I scribbled on my wax tablet with shaking hands. Honor restored, games redeemed. But then the sponsor stood up. He strode into the ring, arms spread, golden amphora in hand. Behold, he shouted, these victories, this glory, this honor, it is all thanks to Storm Nectar, the drink of champions. The crowd laughed, of course, old habits die hard. Some booed, some jeered, some chanted new absurdities. Storm Nectar, referee's choice. Drink first, win later. And yet, beneath the laughter, I sensed something else. The jeers were weaker, the chants less venomous. Many in the crowd were still clapping for the athletes, still marveling at the clean throws, the honest victory. For once, the sponsors' antics did not completely drown out the games themselves. The priests seized the moment. They marched to the altar, voices raised in solemn hymns. The smoke of sacrifice curled skyward, fragrant and steady. For the first time all week, the crowd felt quiet, not silenced by exhaustion or mockery, but hushed by awe. I closed my eyes, breathing the incense, letting it cleanse the filth of chaos from my soul. And then the thunder rolled. A storm had been gathering all afternoon, clouds swelling over the mountains. Now the sky split open with a crack of lightning, illuminating the stadium in stark white. The priests cried out, declaring Zeus's blessing. The crowd gasped, then cheered. And yes, of course, some fool shouted, Storm Nectar trademark, proof from Zeus. The laughter returned, but softer this time, woven with wonder rather than mockery. The rain began to fall, washing dust from the stones, cooling the athletes' sweat, dampening the torn banners. The crowd lifted their faces, arms wide, as if baptized by Olympus itself. For the first time, I felt no despair, no shame, only relief. The games, against all odds, had ended not in disgrace, but in something resembling beauty. I scrawled my final note with trembling hands. The festival survives. Chaos mocked us. Laughter haunted us. But in the end, honor stood tall. May Zeus remember this day kindly. And with that, I laid down my stylus, let the rain soak my weary body, and whispered the only words I had strength left to say, thank the gods, it's over.